Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Ministry Toolbox. I am Steve Lindsley, Executive Presbyter for Providence Presbytery, and continuing our Ministry Toolbox series. Our special speaker for this episode is this guy. I'm going to be doing a series on generosity and giving. As we all know, at least if you're watching this around the time that it's being recorded, it is September, or almost September, which means in churches stewardship. That 3 or 4 or 5 weeks in the fall when we ask people to make a pledge for next year and receive pledge cards. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Many of you know that in addition to my work with Presbytery, I also work with Horizons Stewardship, working one-on-one with congregations on generosity and things like fall stewardship. So I'd like to go through a slide deck I've got here, a presentation called The Generosity Journey. And we'll look at this together. So bear with me as I get this going. And Katie, thanks in advance for editing this long pause out. So let's dive into the generosity journey together. One of the questions I always like to ask people when it comes to talking about giving and generosity is to share their generosity story. Everyone has a generosity story, which is basically that point in time in our life, our youngest memory we have of when we first learned about giving, about having something of ours and giving it to someone else. My giving story happened when I was a kid and growing up in Raleigh, North Carolina. And every dinner, when we all gathered around that kitchen table to have our dinner together, every night my brother and I would find in the middle of the table a small jar. It was there for every meal, and the idea was that at every meal, all of us sat down at the table. Before we ate food, we put some change that we had in that jar every night that we sat around the table for dinner. And my mom and dad told us that this was something that our church was doing to help feed hungry people all over the world. And I remember thinking, when I was, even as a young kid, I remember thinking to myself, yeah, I don't know about that. I don't know if the little pennies and nickels and every once in a while a quarter in this little jar on our kitchen table is going to make any real difference when it comes to feeding hungry people. So I was a skeptical 7 or 8 year old. But then every first Sunday of the month, something amazing would happen, and this is what I remember most about generosity. Every Sunday morning, my family and I, when we went to church, we would grab that small jar or cup off the table and take it with us to church. And walking into worship before, we would walk into the narthex, and in the narthex we would find a bunch of these huge glass jars. And we were bringing our little small jar of coin, and others were bringing their little small jar. And I just remember going up and pouring those coins into that big, huge jar. And, it would, the narthex floor was like tile or marble or something. So the sound of these coins upon coins, emptying out into this big, big, huge glass jar, multiple jars there on tables in the narthex. And what I remember is that when we left, walked out after worship, I would look and I would see these big, huge glass jars full of so many coins, the amount of which I couldn't even imagine at that young age. And what that taught me about giving at a young age was all the giving that God gives to us, and all the giving that we give back is from the heart and matters. And it's not about the amount that I give. It's about the faithfulness by which I give, again, every meal at dinner, and knowing that in the end, that giving with a giving of others could turn into something really, really marvelous. So that's my story of that time when I really remember learning about giving. And I encourage you to think about what your story might be as well. So before we dive into kind of best practices of stewardship, I want to lay the foundation a little bit. Step back so that we can sort of see the full picture of what giving in America is like today, and then giving in the church. And here is the issue in a nutshell for churches. In the church, it's not a giving problem that we have. It is a giving to the church problem. So I'll say that again. We don't have a giving problem. What we have is a giving to the church problem. And I'm going to show you some statistics to kind of back that up. These are all in the United States of America. And when we look at the total giving in our country over the last 40 plus decades, we see a steadily climbing giving to whatever agencies anywhere in America. So what's interesting, over the 40 years, there's been a consistent and steady climb in the total number of dollars that Americans give to different benevolent causes. So remember that. When we put that against what individuals giving as a share of their disposable income is, we find an interesting statistic. Because even as that total giving in our country is increasing, the average income across the country, the average giving of individuals as a share of disposable income has remained pretty much flat, right at 2% over that same 40-year period. Now, here is the thing that will kind of blow your socks off and give you an idea of the problem that we have. When we look at the past 10 years, just 10 years, look at this just amazing explosion of different 501c3 organizations, from just over 1 million in 2013 to 10 years later, over 1.5 million. And so think about this. What you have is giving increasing, incomes remaining mostly stagnant, and the number of places that people can give their benevolent dollars has gone up immensely. And again, these 501c3s are people out there, organizations out there that are getting dollars that the church might otherwise get if those organizations weren't there. So we do not have a giving problem. We have a giving to the church problem. The slices of the pie are getting smaller and smaller, which means the church is getting less and less. And we are not always making the best case to people about why they're giving to the church matters. And that's going to be something that we get to in a second. But before we do, I want to talk about generational giving, because some trends that we are seeing are very hopeful. 22% of millennial giving per household increased in 2024. And then that surpassed Gen X. So the giving from millennials per household has actually gone up and surpassed Gen X, usually relatively reliable source to the church. 16% of Gen Z, so this is kind of high school and mid-20s and below, 16% of Gen Z increased their giving and more than double giving to faith-based organizations. That is not insignificant. Likewise, 82% of Gen Z and 70% of the millennials attend in-person religious service at least a few times a year. Now, we can have a separate ministry toolbox about what membership is in the church today and what defines a regular attendee and all that kind of stuff. But in the culture we live in, people, 82% of Gen Z and 70% of millennials are active in some way or shape or form in a faith-based house, faith-based. So they are showing up with us. They are giving more. But back to that question, we we don't have a giving problem in this country. We have a giving to the church problem. So are we giving the people out there a reason to give to their church? So hold on to that question as we talk about just some theology and Bible. This is something we want to pay attention to as we're contemplating generosity and giving. So we start with the fact that we have an extremely generous God. God who gave everything that we have, continues to give everything that we have. Jesus giving his life for us. And so we have a generous God. That generosity by nature is transformational. And because we have a generous God, we are built, designed, created to be generous. And when we respond to God through generosity, when we respond to God's generosity through our generosity, it changes the giver and reshapes the heart. We also really want to emphasize that stewardship is not just a transaction, and we don't want to give our members any impression that it's transactional in nature. What we do want to emphasize is that giving and generosity is a part of discipleship, of the whole person serving Jesus and serving others and striving to be more like Jesus. So we worship a generous God who calls us to be generous in turn. That generosity transforms both the giver and the one receiving. And then giving is an integral part of our understanding of discipleship and following Jesus. So a little bit of either ors to kind of look at here, the left column being the transactional church and the right column being the transformational church. So in a transactional church, it is all about asking for money, and everything is framed in the context of we need you to give money. So a budget document is shared. There are appeals that say here are our needs, and we need this and we need that. So it is reduced to the baseline asking for money. In a transformational church, that same effort or intention is more about invitation and inviting people into a time of spiritual growth where generosity flourishes. And that's not just fancy talk. It is a whole different way of approaching this time of year that can really be helpful as a pastor, as a church leader, to start to create a DNA in your church where people view giving in perhaps a way than they have before. In the transactional church, we talk about needs. We position everything as we need this and we need that. In the transformational church, the talk that we do is more about God's generosity and the ways that it inspires us to be like kind. So again, we're not shining a spotlight and making the sole focus on replacing the window over here or putting in a new boiler over there or whatever it might be. We are talking about a spiritual journey of discipleship and how giving and generosity can flow from that. In the transactional church, it is a one-time ask. And you could say stewardship is not because you do it every year, but in the context of a year, it is in a lot of churches framed as a one-time ask, 4 weeks where people either come or don't come to church because they know it's stewardship, right? So it's kind of pocketed in a particular way. In the transformational church, giving and generosity is a lifelong endeavor. It's a journey. You're never at a point where you've arrived, and there's always an opportunity to experience giving rather than just here's the time for these 4 weeks in October when we need you to contemplate what you're going to give. So that's, I think, a helpful framing in a lot of ways of the kind of church. Obviously, we want to help churches be transformational. So just thinking about that. I love this quote here. That talks about the fact, and this is another thing that's really important, money follows mission. Mission not being like outreach programs, but the mission, the vision of the church, its hopes and its dreams. When a church is really good at articulating that, they put themselves in a much better place for their people to respond in generosity, okay? So fundraising is first and foremost a form of ministry. It is a way of announcing our vision and of inviting other people into our mission. It's an interesting way of understanding fundraising in the church, right? When we seek to raise funds, we are not saying, please, could you help help us out because lately it's been hard. Rather, we are declaring we have a vision that is amazing and exciting. We are inviting you to invest yourselves through the resources that God has given you, your energy, your prayers, and your money in this work to which God has called us. I love this quote, and this might surprise some people, from Henry Nouwen, who is a noted spiritualist and writing about all those kinds of things, and yet he wrote this wonderful book, tiny book, but incredibly impactful, called The Spirituality of Fundraising. So that's a very different way of understanding the stewardship season, right? It's not about meeting a budget. It's not about meeting needs. It's about inviting people to be part of a vision that is amazing and exciting, and how your generosity might be inspired by that and through that. So I love that quote. I think it's good. What I want to do is I want to talk about the best practices of generosity. So 6 simple things that you can do. And just full disclosure, I'm going to dip into a little bit of my work with Horizon Stewardship, because a lot of this stuff in here comes from the framing at least. The main thing to understand when it comes to creating cultures of generosity in your church, particularly as stewardship season approaches, there's no silver bullet, crude expression that is. It's a lot of things working together that help to create that culture that you're aspiring for. So let's talk about a few things. Six categories in particular, and then some things to do. Keeping it spiritual. So as we talked about before, the spiritual, theological, biblical foundation is key. That helps to keep us from the stewardship and fundraising and being transactional in nature. So how do we keep it spiritual in this work? The first thing is that we focus on discipleship, again, mentioning that as part of the whole person. Are we encouraging and teeing up our people to grow spiritually, assisting in the church and the growing of faith of others, and highlighting joy? So back to that, this is a similar quote to the Nouwen. Never talk about people's money apart from their discipleship. Never talk about the church's money apart from its mission and its vision. So the more that we can really get to that next level, or maybe the better expression is the deeper level, the more that we can do that, we put our people in the best position to view this as a spiritual journey. The second thing is telling your ministry story. I think that I know the church has an amazing story to tell, and yet we are often the lousiest at telling it. So we think about Jesus, who, when he had the things he really wanted to hit home on, teachings and that kind of thing, he would sometimes preach on it, but many times he would tell stories. We call them parables. And the point became even more obvious and ingrained doing that. So there's something about stories that can really empower us and stick with us. One of the simple things I love to do, and this is an every all year endeavor in the church, is leading into that time of offering, rather than simply saying, and now it's time to receive our tithes and offerings. Taking a moment in there to share a 2-minute anecdote about something that you have seen in church this past Sunday, or some way that your church made an impact, and naming that impact, and then saying to the congregation, thanks to your generosity, we were able to send this child to school that really needed to be part of a loving community. We would not have been able to do without you. Thanks to your generosity, this child's life has impacted in a major way. And you can help support that work of the church and other things, the ministries and missions of this church, by giving your tithes and offerings. Now, friends, it is time to receive our tithes and offerings. So just taking 2 minutes to lead into your offering talk. Now, I'll be honest with you. I started doing this in my last couple of years at Trinity before I came to be with you all. And I went into it with a little bit of trepidation. I thought there would be people who wouldn't like the fact that it added 2 or 3 minutes to the service. I also just didn't know if that was shining a glaring spotlight on giving in a way that would make people feel uncomfortable. What I found is that people loved it, to the point where I remember one lady coming to me and telling me, I just love that time in our service. Yeah, I think it's my favorite part of the whole service that you lead. Which I remember thinking, that's awesome. And also, I didn't know what that said about my preaching for 15 minutes, right? But the point is, people love stories. and you contextualize it, and that way you are really helping draw the bound between people's giving and their generosity and the impact that it can have. So that's a good one to do. Build giver or investor relationships, whatever language you would call. One of the things that I think is really important and could be a question for churches to sometimes wrestle with is whether the pastor knows how much the members give. There are two schools of thought on that. One is the thought that says we don't want the pastor to know who gives because we want them to treat everybody equally, and we don't want to trouble them with numbers and dollars because their real concern ought to be in the spiritual realm, if it were. That's one school of thought. The other school of thought says, well, actually, by the pastor having access to that information in the same way they would have access to other information about that person, you are allowing them actually to better minister to that person. If you have concerns that they might be someone who misuses that information, you probably have bigger issues on your hand than that particular issue. Giving is a part of a person's spirituality, so it helps a pastor know better how to minister to them. For instance, if someone is a consistent giver, has been for years, and then all of a sudden stops giving for 2 or 3 months, well, that would make me wonder as a pastor, well, something has happened, and just as it's not about the money as much as I'm just concerned about them as a person. Did they lose a job? Did they have some major expense come up that they are having to devote to that? Because those are pastoral concerns, right? So that's a whole conversation I'm happy to have with you if you want to talk about that. But making sure that the pastor is connecting with all givers in the church in a way that feels authentic to them. Making the ask, and I personally changed the language. I like the language of invite and invitation better. Again, sometimes we are not great as a church of making that invitation, that ask, because we don't want to bother people with money talk, or we just want to. We think it's 4 weeks in October and then we're done with it. Thank goodness. So there's an importance of a regular invitation for people to give, such as that offering talk at the offering time that you might do, really encouraging online and especially recurring giving, coming up with some document you can share with people either digitally or in hand that walks them through the why it's important for recurring, meaning why to the church, and how to do it. Going to the website and how to do it, or making that really easy so that people can set up recurring giving. A narrative budget, a very short answer of that is instead of leading with an Excel document, which you're going to also have, you lead with a document that really talks about the different the vision that you have for the church for the coming year and that their dollars will go to. And that's specific ministries, programs, the kinds of things that you're wanting to do and helping folks do that. You lead with that, and then you say, if you would like the Excel copy, the budget, here, see this person or whatever. You're really leading with what can be the really important framing of, again, this is an invite, not an ask, and doing that. I always encourage churches to use giving cards instead of pledge cards. There's a demographic in our church, an older demographic, that when they sign a pledge card to their church, it's like signing in blood. And many people will not do that because they do not want the guilt that will occur if for some reason they have to modify that gift mid-year. So I encourage people to start using estimate of giving cards. It's a little bit of a mouthful. It doesn't flow off the tongue as well as pledge card, and we've been using pledge cards forever, so it's hard to change. But an estimate of giving card really, when you start saying that and it starts sinking and people get that all this is it's a faithful guess. Life circumstances may happen that need to change that. But doing that. So I just encourage you to do that and sort of have folks bring them up if that's in your culture on a Sunday morning. Um, Measuring effectiveness. Sometimes we finish the stewardship season and we get that, what we think is that last estimate of giving card and go, oh, thank goodness. And we don't think about anything until in the summer when we're like, oh my gosh, stewardship is right around the corner. So one of the things that's a good thing to do in January on this side of the year is to take time to look back on the stewardship season, what worked well, what didn't work well, and just seeing what you can learn rather than just saying thank goodness that's over, and then we go straight to go straight to the next stewardship season. So just take stock in January. It's a good time to take stock of how you're providing information to people, how you're inviting them, the framing of it. Are you doing all the things that you can really do to put people in the best position possible? And then lastly, maintain trust and accountability. So making sure you have good internal control systems, sharing your financial information in the church, in whatever means that is, on some kind of regular basis in a way that's easily digestible for people. That way they know that they're seeing the whole picture of things. And then, just sharing the missional priorities and how they should drive budgeting, staffing, facility, mission initiatives. So anytime, as a pastor, we would do quarterly statements. I always included a letter at the front of that, either that I wrote or the chair of stewardship wrote or something like that, thanking people for their giving. Here's a record of it. If you have any questions, see so-and-so. And then, very similar to the offering talk, because of your generosity this past quarter, we were able to do this. You don't need a whole long list, just 3 or 4 things that you can think of, but it is drawing the super direct connection between people's giving and the impact that it has. And that is pretty much the extent of it. So I hope that some of this in here has been helpful as you are thinking about stewardship approaching. Blessings to you as that time comes. If you have any questions about anything in this presentation tonight, just let me know. I would love to talk to you. Blessings to you, friends, and a joyous and generous-filled stewardship season in your congregation. Thank you.